Welcome to myUX. It's a show about games with two people who play games and sometimes make games occasionally. Um, my name is Scott Mulligan, and with me I have.
Matthew Ventures. Hey.
Great. Today we're going to be talking about a game called Dungeons and Dragons. Now, it's important to note Dungeons and Dragons has many different versions, and we're specifically probably going to be talking about version 2, correct?
That's my favorite version. We could talk about other versions and what we don't like about them. I'm pretty
Okay,
well
well,
versed.
Matt, what the hell is D&D?
Dude, that would be a good one for you to address. I don't know. D&D. So D&D it's a tabletop RPG role playing game. So we've already covered one role playing game on this community, right? We talked about what was it? That other one, RuneScape. And now we're talking about a very different kind of RPG. It's not an MMORPG, not massive multiplayer online. It's in person and I guess small, but still multiplayer. And the role of D&D is, instead of meeting with these people online to create your characters, you're meeting in person and you're rolling dice and you're creating characters with the old pen and paper. So it's old school for sure.
Yeah, and you can play D&D online, but I personally think it's probably best to play in person. There's just something about playing in person that's just a lot more fun, in my opinion. And that's not to discredit anybody who plays online, but in my experiences, I've just gotten so much out of being with my fondest memories of D&D are being with a group of friends either after school, playing with like a teacher or something, or playing with you guys for like hours and hours on end in your basement as you as DM or GM. So the GM is the game master or the dungeon master, doesn't really matter.
So Scott, what I guess turned you on to this? When did you decide, hey, I want to go play with Matthew in his basement. I want to play with my teacher after school.
Well, actually, one of my friends from high school, Kyle, was into D&D, and he wanted to play after school. I don't know if you know what's interesting is I'm kind of lumping a bunch of things together because we didn't necessarily. I'm lumping in like role playing RPGs that you play as a group of
That's fair.
people.
Yeah, Call of Cthulhu. We could all
Yeah,
call it one thing.
exactly. And at first I was like, okay, I guess I'm down to play something after school. And I didn't really know what it was, and I just wanted to try it out. And I'm really grateful that I did because it was so interesting to because it fit because the first time I played, it was actually set in the modern day, which I know isn't really Dungeons and Dragons, but bear with me here. It was set in the modern day, and I still even vividly remember what we did. We were like in an apartment complex, and it was just like, yeah, feel free to do whatever you want for the first little bit. And it was one of the weirdest experiences ever because it was like the best video game where you can do whatever the hell you want.
Yeah, there's definitely two things I have to say for D&D off the bat. And the first is that, without a doubt, it has made... Oh, I lost your video feed. It has made for some of the most memorable experiences.
Uh,
Unlike a lot of video games, I can remember D&D campaigns so vividly. And I think a big part of that is because a lot of it takes place in your imagination. And it's weird because for that reason it would seem less real. But in fact, due to that, I actually have an easier time remembering it. And I think that's because, I don't know, maybe just because it's a little more fuzzy. It's kind of like when they say you got to write it. And if you write it, you'll have an easier time remembering it. I think in a similar sense, when you create your own story, you write your own decisions in a sense. You're like being an author, and as part of that, it just increases the recall so well. So that's one thing I want to say to D&D's credit. One thing that I'll say, I guess, against D&D is, unlike a traditional video game, the experience is so dependent on who you play it with. Really, playing D&D, we talk about Call of Cthulhu, D&D. In reality, despite having these different sects of RPGs, it is diversified even more so by who you're playing it with, and like who the dungeon master is, who's in charge of the rules, and who composes your party, what approach you have to the game. that makes a really big difference, and certainly it's been a make or break situation. So I've been with parties where the people are super fun, they're cool, it's fun to hang out with them and have silly characters. And I've been in other campaigns where it's not fun, it's very serious, and it's just not to say I don't like a serious game every now and then, but it's not as enjoyable in those particular experiences. So I think it really does depend who you're with, which is different because not all video games are like that.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. And you said, why is it easier to recall D&D? And I think it's also because sometimes the situations get so weird and they get so specific that it's hard not to remember what happened because it's like, oh yeah, that one time we went into the shop and the old man blacksmith hit on us, and then one of our party members hit on him back, and then he turned out to be a walrus who he like transformed into a walrus, and then we fought him and had to murder him, and we stole all of his stuff. Like it's like this weird kind of very specific journey that you go on. And then in addition to that, it's just like this is something we talk about a lot with the games. Is like the feeling of it in terms of because when I say being in person is better, I also feel like it's better because you feel more of a connection to the people you're with, and you feel like a real part. Like the best D&D sessions are where you feel like a real party with the people in it, for better or worse. Like you either hate the members of the people with you, or you love them, and you kind of grow stronger together. And then also in addition to that, if you're all together like in your basement eating pizza or eating pretzels or whatever snack, I know you liked healthier snacks, there was just something fun about kind of that collective coming together. It was like there's like a meta of D&D where you're playing the game and then the meta is you're 5 hours in and you and your friends are getting exhausted and tired, but it feels like a real journey. So you have the journey of the game itself and then like the actual journey outside of the game.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy how long sessions last. It's definitely longer than a normal video game, I guess. And to be honest, though, that's a big part where D&D divides because I think the biggest difference with some parties is like some diligent dungeon masters have more of a railroad story, or at least they construct their narrative in such a way that they kind of know what they want to do at what point. And because of that, every mission, every session, it feels live, it feels active, and it feels like you're on an adventure. Whereas other ones, it feels like half of the adventure takes place on the back of the horse getting there, and it really does suck. It's really slow. So
Well, you think that sucks? Because
it
sometimes
depends. It depends. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it's fun, right? It's rare, though, I feel, that you get a group of people where people are at the level of, I guess, proficiency with role playing that you can have banter that's as engaging as the actual story campaign.
that's an interesting point. How do you encourage, if you're because both you and I have been DMs, we've been GMs, how do you encourage the people playing your game to do banter? Like, how do you
Yeah,
encourage?
that's a great question. When it comes to just D&D advice in general, I have found when you speak to the meta, there's a huge community of dungeon masters online, YouTube, the players DM, there's that other guy, and I would listen for hours of different stories and puzzles that people would make up. These DMs would go on YouTube and share their stories, and I love that. So I really love that community. And I certainly did look up a lot of advice on how to get players involved and stuff like that. One of them is, uh, I mean, if you want to get technical, right, the currency system in the game is experience points, but there's also other stuff that you could play with. So you can give experience for RPG settings and how you deal with your character and how you resolve situations. For example, some dungeon masters will give experience for maybe more experience if you don't kill the enemy, but you find another way to do it if it's like still true to your character. If people do exceptional role playing, you might want to use this kind of new term. It's kind of new on the street. It's called inspiration die. And the idea of that is you get a little d6 that you can like add to any roll. So if you roll a 1d20 plus a 1d6, could be a big difference if you're fighting the
Is that
bad guy.
new? That's new?
That's kind of D&D 5 meta.
Okay.
But I loved it. I thought it was a great idea. So I've thrown it into some of my games. It really depends, right? Everybody has a different approach to it. And what I love is coming up with stuff that people have to do in real life. Because then it's not like a divide anymore. It's like, no, that's actually my character. So what I did one time was I gave players like a physical puzzle, and they had to solve it in person, and that really helps to kind of
Yeah, I was one of those players who
yeah. So that
played.
helps to bridge the gap. And another thing I did one time, one of my best things I think, was I had everybody come for a feast, and during the feast I actually gave them real sparkling something, right, Martinelli's sparkling juice or something, and once they drank it in real life, that counted as the player drinking it, and then they got like a poison or something. So that was kind of fun. Try and bridge the gap of like what's real, what's not. In Call of Cthulhu, which is a game where you're doing a research as a detective, you're coming across all these case files and newspaper clippings. What I would do is I'd provide those all in real life. So you'd be handed the newspaper or the Matchbox card, and people kind of holding that had a sense of like realism. So that really helped.
That's awesome. And I think the other thing that I just add to that is going along with the characters that people bring to the table, if that makes sense. Like a lot of experienced role players will come in with a character, and if you kind of help them and give them situations where their character can be whatever they are. Like let's say somebody comes in and they're like a bowsmith, or they're an archer rather, and you could give them a situation where you're like, there's a magical bow on his wall in his shop that only the best archers in all the land can touch, and like, but this guy is very sensitive that if you touch it he will murder you on sight. Like, so you could add like layers like that to encourage people to play their characters out.
Yeah,
um
I love
the
that.
only One of the issue, if we were talking about it, you were talking about an issue before, which I think was true in terms of it depends on the people you're with. One of the issues I have, and I had, because I only DM'd like only a couple times, once with you guys and a couple times with other friends, um, was that it's this weird balance of wanting to limit the player as much as possible so you can tell your story, but also not wanting to be a dick. I'm sorry, limiting it, but also wanting to have fun and like
Mm.
allowing them to tell their story. And I find that like it's a fine balance.
It's a very difficult to DM a game and to be a good DM. I would agree. It's probably the hardest game to be kind of the rules guy for. Like you take another board game like I don't know Monopoly or something, or even a game that's a video game, and it's pretty easy to explain to the person the controls. But this whole idea of you could do anything and then how to properly, I guess, be a rules lawyer about that without being a negative guy, yeah, it's really tough. One of the things which you touched upon, which I'd like to talk about, is story, right? And when we're looking at these games in myUX, that's definitely one of the four tenets we're looking at, story. Um, I, as a very narrative-driven designer, love to build kind of worlds and stories and kind of have a relatively planned out path. It might have multiple endings or options, but I do try to stick to the story because that's what I get out of it. And I think, in truth, it's probably what a lot of players look back to. It's rare that I think people value like the mechanics. It's often the story of the game. They're retelling you the adventure, not necessarily like what they rolled, with the exception of like, oh, and then I rolled a critical, right? Which I think is actually only relevant because the critical has story narrative significance. It's like, oh, and then I was able to throw the axe. So I try to focus on the story. And the frustration I have is that in the game, I have a lot of difficulty in setting up player arcs because the players don't really change that much in the story, and there's not a lot of good mechanics to have that. And so that's something I've seen kind of change in recent revisions. So this certainly wasn't around in second edition. But in fifth edition and onwards, you might, or Call of Cthulhu, for example, you have to list like the player's fears, the player motivation. What is something that if they had the opportunity to do it, they would never not do it. And I think these are kind of like structural crutches to help people kind of build a narrative around their characters rather than just being a list of hit points, essentially. Because a lot of people won't engage with that role playing unless they're, I guess, forced to do it. So yeah, I hated that. I hate that I couldn't have like arcs for my characters. And that's something that I'd like to. I definitely would tweak if I was going to homebrew a version.
That's really interesting. I played once. It wasn't. It was I'm not sure if it was D&D, but we had vices and virtues, and your character had vices and virtues. And it was so funny to watch people be like, to say their character's virtue or vice. Like they'd be like let's say it was lust was their vice. It's like every time a beautiful woman or man walked into the room, that character would immediately, you already know what that character is going to do. But you're right in terms of like having them build an arc with that character, like going from this very lustful person to a charming person who is not held back by it. And the other thing you brought up was the dice rolls and a critical hit. And you are right that that's involved with story, but I want to touch on something that I think is really interesting is people will often criticize luck in video games and they'll say that it's a bad thing, right?
Mm.
They'll be like, oh, that's so unfair. Like, oh, especially in like League of Legends, if somebody gets a ton of crits, it's like, oh, no skill. They just got a ton of crits in a row. They got super lucky. But I think luck is a really important thing in terms of making memorable moments in video games. So like in D&D, even though it doesn't really require skill and to roll and get a 20, when you get that 20, it creates this awesome moment where your whole party is like, yes, or when you get a critical failure and you get a 1, it creates a memorable moment too. And I think you need that to first of all spice things up, and then secondly to add a little bit of variable to the game where it's like if you have these expert D&D players, it can really shake things up.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, by the way, your video cut out, so maybe you could just flick it on and off again or something. I can't see you. Okay, yeah, now it's working. Yeah, for sure. And you know what? Mechanic wise, I think criticals. Uh, the only thing that I think book wise, the only thing they're supposed to do is like definitely hit. But I think that kind of sucks, right? So I always try to like make it if you critical hit, it's gonna be double damage. Also, it's gonna be like something crazy, you know? And like if it's a critical fail, like because I have played with people who it's just like they roll a critical and they're like, oh, good, double damage, and it's like, no, man, dude, a critical should be like insane, and like that's kind of how I like to play it,
Also,
especially even and also on the negative side. Like if you, because people they want to cringe, dude. You want to kill your best buddy in the back of the head with a wrong arrow. Like that's awesome. And I just feel like those are some of the incredible moments. And also to touch upon the dice rollers in particular, this is something, the physical affordance of rolling a die that video games don't really have. It's so much more meaningful. It just feels so much more real versus like a loot crate spawn or something. It just feels like amazing, like to see the die roll over and to see the numbers go. I really like that. And it's funny because I was actually working. Well, it's not funny. I don't know why people say that. It's just a common phrase. It's parlance, you know. But basically, it's coincidental, perhaps, that I was working on a game recently where you have to roll dice for Facebook, and it's not actually a real dice roll because they have to like do anti-cheat, and because of that, it's like fake. So it's like you roll the dice and you can't really see the number, and then when it's time to show the number, they have a randomly generated number and they show it on the face of the die. So it's almost like a little trick, and I think that's very interesting how that works. Hey, we're recording myUX.
that's fun. What do you mean by how do they have a fake dice roll?
Dude,
Like
we
they
got a guest on the show.
Hey,
Mike
what's up?
Do
Chili.
you have face cam now?
Well, I don't know. This is for Scott probably.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So what's going on, man?
Just finished mine actually podcast.
That's awesome. Great job. I'll see you around.
Well, give a
Thanks for
shout
dropping
out to
Shout
Keisha.
out to Chili Channel.
Are you live?
Yeah, we're live, dude. I guess. No, we're not really live. This is all pre-recorded.
It's like you can do that.
Yeah. It takes me a long time to do the editing. All right. See you later, pal. That's my little brother. Go check out his gaming channel, Chili something, Chili Soup. Good channel.
Yeah. What were we saying? Dice. Oh yeah. So randomly, yeah. Because you know what's so funny about that? I was thinking about that. This is a bit of a tangent, but I was thinking about lotteries and also arcades because lotteries back in the day, right? They would have coins come out. And they'd have coins shoot out of the thing when you win. But nowadays, when you pull the thing, there are no coins that really come out. But they still make the sound of the coins, and they still make like they make it look like there's coins, like an animation of coins. And it's funny to me because it's like, oh well, we don't have coins anymore, but the coins they want all the great things about the coins without the actual coin themselves.
Yeah, we have that in our game too. We have a coin sound when you buy money, right?
Yeah, and like it sounds like money because it's fun. It's fun.
It's
It's
fun.
it's
Yeah.
fun to hear the coins coming down. But I wonder if that it's fun because that's how societally like we associate the sound of coins running down with that lottery thing, and then we've just been perpetuating the sound of that to you get what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
it's like in reality, if we were totally disconnected and we had no idea, we'd just be like, oh, it just sounds weird. Like but in reality, since we have all these things that, oh, coins coming down is money because of the casinos, it will forever in 1,000 years, there will still be the sound of coins, even though it's all digital. like,
Yeah.
and people be like, there was physical coins.
Let's talk about sound for a moment. So the other one of the other four tenets that we think about when we think about games in this model is aesthetics. And this game has interesting aesthetics, I guess you could say. It's a different kind of take on that. A big part of it is kind of the oral tradition of storytelling. But I'm interested if any of the times you played D&D or some other tabletop role-playing game, if they did something with the oral landscape or they used some visual aid that I don't know, really impacted the weight of the story or your UX.
I mean, it's always beneficial for the DM to have like a speaker, like a Bluetooth speaker comes in clutch if you're a GM or a DM, because you could play some sort of background music. Like if they're for example, if it's a you used to when we got into a battle, you'd hear like dun 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 dun, dun and it made you feel like you were in a battle. Or when
Yeah.
you were in the town, you'd hear like, and then and then the DM would be like, and then you hear the sound of the little children playing and you'd have like sound of a village and it made you feel like you were in a village so those kind of things work or if you just have sound cues like you hear it like and if the DM is really good and they're able to just like play it without without you noticing that they're playing it, you know what I mean, and it comes as a surprise, that's really fun as well, just like random sounds.
Yeah. Do you feel like any of the DMs you were with did good voices? Because I that's definitely something I tried to have different voices. I don't know how I with varying degrees of success.
I don't know. I don't even remember you doing different voices, to be honest. I just remember you reading like maybe the old man. You'd be like, welcome to my shop." like if anything, yeah. So I don't really remember, but I think if a DM really gets into it and they really like go for it and they get like a new costume for every single character, like it really is dependent on. I think you said it's dependent on the people who you're with. I think it can also be super dependent on whoever is the DM. Like I think the game is
Yeah.
very much so can either suck or be awesome because of the DM as well. It's like you said, it's one of the most difficult positions in all of gaming.
I think so. Yeah, because it's the creator, really, right? It's like, what's harder than playing League of Legends? It's to make League of Legends.
Well, first of all, I think that's giving League of Legends too much credit. When you go into a game of League of Legends, you know what you're gonna get. Like you're gonna go to your lane, you're gonna rack up minions, you're gonna attack the towers, you're gonna go for the Nexus. When you go into a game of D&D, it's like, oh my God, I got Charlie who wants to go into this fucking tunnel. I got Jimmy who wants to attack the dragon. I
Yeah.
got Katie who wants to go flying in the middle of nowhere and try to ruin everything. And then you just have players who are just assholes and who are just like, yeah, I try to murder the guy next to me. It's like, no, don't,
Yeah,
you
it's
can't do
hard to
that.
manage splitting the party and stuff like that.
Well, splitting the party, I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to get your thoughts. Like, if a player is going off on their own, how far? Because I find that other players can find it really boring when they're just sitting there hearing about the adventures of Galax the gnome for 20 minutes.
Yeah,
And you're,
typically you don't want to do that. I mean, very long at all. It depends, right? It also depends into what degree the party's engaged, right? So there are examples where it works just fine. One that I can think of is the party gets to the castle wall and it's like, oh man, what's gonna happen on the other side of the wall? Let's send the ranger to go watch. So he climbs up the wall and it's kind of a single player game at that point, but everybody's listening in because they want to see what happens. Versus the gnome goes to meet his girlfriend at the local bungalow and it's like, well, nobody cares about your crazy story, dude. Your side quest mission. Like it depends on the relevancy of the topic, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's really difficult for a DM to manage that because you'll have because people are naturally, or at least I think some people are naturally destructive, and it's just like fun to, especially with D&D, because we're so used to video games. Like, no, you can't kill this character. No, you
Yeah.
can't jump over this wall. No, you can't. But in D&D, you kind of have to be pretty flexible, and if there's a wall that can be jumped over, then what you better be prepared for having something over the wall.
Yeah, I did enjoy that aspect of it. It's kind of like the players could do anything. But what I found was that players aren't crazy. At least some people were, but honestly, like it was never so. I never had someone who like wanted to throw my game off course. And if I did, I'd just talk to them and be like, "Hey, man, this is a game. I have this planned. You can't do that." And people were pretty understanding. So but obviously, you never want to do that, right? The whole thesis of improv is the yes and, right? So of course you don't want to do that, but sometimes I think it's easier to do that because there are some people who are way too dedicated to it, and that pisses me off too. A DM who's like, "Oh, you can do whatever you want, just So it's like, all right, I searched the bookcase. Do I see anything?" He's like, "No, you don't." It's like, well, what should I do? And he doesn't tell you, and it's like, dude, like I'm trying to play the game. Like, what do I need to do here? And it's kind of annoying. So I do appreciate some of that, I guess.
You try to go into that door, it's locked. I try to break it open. It's a very hard door. I use a spell.
Yeah.
It's an impenetrable, has a magical barrier that does a lot of
Yeah,
spells.
yeah, that also, because sometimes the DM doesn't want you to do anything, and that sucks. Like, you should always be able to roll for it. Like, it's like, I tickled the demon. Okay, sure. Let's see what
And then you could
happens.
punish the player too if you
Yeah, you
really
could punish
wanted
the
to.
player.
Like if they were like like I tickle the demon and it's like okay roll and then they get a two and you're like you go to tickle the demon and he eats you.
He kills you, dude. Yeah. Speaking to mechanics, this is one thing that just came up onto my mind. One of the biggest frustrations I had as a DM is that in D&D, combat takes a long time. It took like forever in fourth edition. That's what it's known for, right? But there's other editions where it takes a really long time. Fifth edition I think takes much longer too, and it's kind of annoying. I like combat to go fast. It shouldn't take forever, especially because I'm a narrative driven DM, right? Obviously. But the thing is that combat scales linearly with the number of players, and that's a real pain in the ass. So basically, if you want to add a new enemy, that means he has to roll an extra die for each thing that he's doing for each turn, which does not scale well. And it means that if you have 4 people in the party, that they ideally really can't fight like more than, I don't know, a few people. And D&D does often boil down to just something very lame of like the one bad guy and 4 people punching him every turn, and that's pretty lame. So one of the challenges I always had was trying to get around that without having too many characters. So like I'd often just have people and like they're literally just hit points, and it's like they're there to die and they're probably not going to do very much. Or I'd have like every character kind of like has the same stats, and I'd kind of forget like what each one's doing. Or I'd try to set up set pieces where I'd have like 5 people will come in, and like you see there's a creaky beam and you shoot the beam and it falls down and it kills all 5 at once. That way I could kind of have a set piece without like having to manage the stats of 5 people.
Hmm.
And I don't know, I try to get really creative with that because with video games it's super easy to spawn in somebody to fight him, right? But with tabletop games, very complicated to add an extra person, or at least it's more difficult. Let's say that because you have to roll, right? And sometimes you make it up as a DM, which is fine. That's something we should talk about. D&D is a game where the game cheats, right? And like the dungeon master, he cheats a lot, so you kind of got to manage that. Well, what's your take on that whole situation? Where kind of the game doesn't have a hard set of rules, or maybe video games cheat also. I don't know. What's your
I mean,
take on
it's
it?
like a in-person AI director. You know what I mean? Like you should take advantage of it. If your players are just making mincemeat of your first couple of enemies and it doesn't seem like they're having fun, then it's time to maybe in the next encounter you throw in a couple more things to really make it a little juicier and a little more fun. You know. Um,
Yeah.
Alternatively, you can make your enemies deal more damage, or you could give them more health. Personally, like you have to be careful because if you give your enemy too much health, it may feel like a bullet sponge, and then the players are just like literally whacking down this guy for years on end. I don't know. I've always found I think 100% the DM should be allowed to cheat. Like I don't think there should be controversy there, but I think he has to be fair. It's like you have to remember as a DM that the game is not about you. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, and it's a very selfless position. Like you're trying to give as great an experience to your players as possible. And if that involves making things easier or making things harder, that's up to you ultimately.
Hmm.
Engage where the people are, because some people like challenge, and if you know your friends, give them a little bit of challenge. But sometimes people like it, like they play it for the story. So it's like let them play it for the story then.
One of the biggest things that I learned, and I think honestly, this is a takeaway that it's harder to implement in games, but it's just as relevant, is like story and combat don't have to be separate things. And I think that's very interesting. Like this is certainly a big thing in movies, right? Where you don't want a scene where they're just fighting. Like that's why in the middle of like Star Wars, oh my god, right? The famous scene that's written by what's that guy's name where he just says they fight 20 minutes, right? You know that script with George Lucas, that's his name. Right? Horrible scene because nothing happens plot-wise and people realize it. Whereas when he's fighting Darth Vader and he gets pushed over the ledge and Darth Vader's like, I'm your father, and you have a huge plot point tied into the combat, that's way better. Or when he's fighting in front of Emperor Palpatine and he's like, succumb to the dark side, right? It's like, it's good to have the narrative tied into the combat or puzzles tied into the combat, and in D&D, the structure is such that you might want to separate them, but in reality, you want to combine them. So if you have a complicated enemy, you want to have it in such a way that it's not just I fight him with my sword, right? You never want a player, they're like, this is the lamest turn. I'm going to swing my sword at him. You roll, and this is your damage. He takes 10 damage, right? Lame. You want to have something where it's like hard for him to fight him, like maybe a giant eagle is swooping in and you got to worry about that. Or like to defeat this guy, you realize you have to turn this lever and pull this crank. Otherwise, he's not susceptible to this kind of damage or something like that, right? Like you want to have environmental hazards and stuff like that. That makes it exciting, kind of adds story elements or world building elements to the combat. And I think it's tough to like add those all together.
Yeah, and also having the players work together because a lot of it is building a little collective, a little cooperation. And it's like if one guy is a wizard and one guy is a warrior, like trying to bring their skill set together and trying to make that work
Hmm.
is super important. And that's something you can really do and take advantage of in combat. Uh, yeah, I agree with you 100%. It's called Dungeons and Dragons, and dungeons are a big part of the game, and combat's a big part of the game because it's also progression. You know what I mean? Like I know I said earlier, oh, it should, you should gauge it off of the players, but as they get further along in your campaign, they're going to get more abilities, they're going to get more health, they're going to get more used to playing. It's like then you could also kind of ramp up the difficulty because the players are just stronger as well in addition to that, and eventually in D&D their abilities just get like obnoxious. It's like I
Yeah.
shoot giant fireball that does 8 damage to every single person and also has a burning effect that lasts for 50 turns, and
Yeah.
then as a DM you're just like, okay,
Yeah,
what?
it does get pretty crazy, but you can almost always up the notch. Like my games never even touched like gods or something like that, right? Like it's still pretty grounded, and I think it's important to start low because you always want to have that big bad evil force that if you get Satan to turn his head, he could just swing his finger at you. You never want to be so powerful that like you're the most powerful thing in the universe,
you
because
know
then it's not as fun.
D&D teaches us a lot about storytelling in general, right? Because if you are a DM, you quickly learn what a good story is to your players and what isn't. You know what I mean? And that applies to just regular story. Because in a video game, or if you're designing or a book, if you're writing it, you can kind of get away with being very boring and just having your characters do nothing for an hour. But when you're a DM and you have four literal people sitting, or five, or how many you have, sitting there, and you're like, okay, so now you guys you guys go to the library and you look at the books, and then there's this book, and then there's this book, and then there's this book, and then you get a feast, and if you just like boringly describe all the things, and you don't let them do anything, and there's no mission and there's no objective, and people are very quickly going to be like, so what are we doing? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good
so
point.
it's a really good. It also teaches you like, because oftentimes a lot of the time you'll have there's a typical setup, right? Like there needs to be an objective that your players are going on, or it could start out kind of chill and calm, and then eventually the mystery or whatever starts getting revealing in pieces. But have you ever had? I have a question. Have you ever had a Dungeons and Dragons where there was no objective?
Um, I think I have, and in those cases, it's been a bad game. I remember there was
And
one game we played where, for Peter Donrick Clocar's birthday, we wanted to just like go through this tunnel, but like there were these giant ass snakes in the tunnel, but people wanted to do it anyway. But there was no real purpose, and like a giant snake just like killed Tom's character, which is a reoccurring thing. It's good. Like D&D is good for recurring gags too. You definitely gotta hit on that. But yeah, this one guy Tom, he died every time. And one time we learned that like our other guy's character Ryan could have saved him, but he didn't. There's so many like
Well, that's a really interesting. How do you feel about that? I have a question. So, how do you feel about bringing a new? Because I feel like D&D for a new person can be very
it
intimidating,
can,
and they
yeah,
could be like, "Oh my God, what are these bunch of nerds? What are they doing? Like in the basement? Like." And when
yeah.
you invite a new person, they're like,
Okay,
they're
yeah.
like,
Well, I want to touch upon something you said earlier, which ties into this question. So you were talking about party composition, and I truly believe that no game has nailed the relationships between characters of like a core unit like D&D does. Like each of those people, the warrior, the mage, the thief, whatever, like they're pretty essentially locked in and they benefit each other where each is weak. And I think they've done that perfectly. It's become really bad in later versions. D&D 5, very unhappy with it because like the warrior can do magic and he can heal himself, which like totally ruins the purpose of having people who are dedicated to that. And like the whole goal was like magicians suck at low levels. They need to be protected. But at high levels, they're like way better than the warriors. And like that was an interesting relationship. And I think as the versions have gotten higher, they've progressively like just squished them all together in this kind of like snowflakes paradox of like everybody's special and everybody's equal. And I think everybody should be special, but they shouldn't all be equal. And that's one of the things I don't like. And what's good if you have people being special and understanding their limitations is that when you have a new player, as you were saying, come in, they have a clearly defined role and relationship. And people love having roles. They love knowing what they need to do and having a checklist almost. So if you can bring in a player and say, dude, those are bad guys. They're going to come through the wall. When they come in, I need you to hold your sword and you need to whack them with the sword, okay? Try your best to not get hit. Roll high numbers. Good luck. And like if they can take that to heart, that's enough. And there are probably some things you could do to encourage role playing, which I think is important, but not everybody's going to be into that, so you got to feel it out.
yeah, it's definitely like, and I think the other thing I want to point out is it's just a really good way to get people together to have fun. You know what I mean? Like, and I think people undermine that in terms of there is definitely a game portion of it. It definitely is a game, but I think it's also about just bringing people together to have a good time for like hours and hours and hours on end. And it's like, and so my point is like there's more to it than just the game. And my question to you is like, why do you think D&D holds this kind of place as that kind of? Well, why do you think it is? Do you think it? Well, I don't want to answer the question myself, but what do you think has transcended it to that position?
I don't know if I understand the question, but I think that's interesting because I do recall that you had some gripes about D&D, especially towards our later engagements with the game. I remember you would say something like, hey man, because our friend group would all play D&D, right? And that's just myUX. But basically, we would all play D&D, and you would say, you know what, guys, I'd love to hang out with you, but I don't want to play D&D because I feel like I'm playing with those characters living in that fake world, and I want to hang out
Well,
IRL.
because what would happen is, because this is going to contradict what I was saying earlier,
I mean,
was
I
that
know because that's how I feel you felt. So I'm interested to hear otherwise.
because literally, because sometimes, even though I said, oh, we would hang out, sometimes we would literally just play D&D, and then we just go like, and we wouldn't have talked for weeks on end, or even like months. We would have just literally played D&D. And then I was like, well, I'm really curious about like what you guys are up to and all this stuff. And then ultimately it was like, would I rather go and play? You know what's funny though? If you were to ask me now, like, oh, would you want to go play 6 hours in D&D or whatever? I would probably say 100% yes. But I think it was then, it was like, oh, well, that sounds like a big commitment. And like, okay, I don't want to do that.
It still sounds like a big commitment. I don't know. I have a hard time dropping 6 hours in anything.
Well, I guess what I mean is that, uh, yeah, you get what I'm saying in terms of like, oh, hey, do I want to go spend 6 hours with you guys, or do I want to talk to you guys for 6 hours, or do I want to play D&D? And it's like, hey, can we just like chill and go grab something to eat? And
Yeah,
that's how I
it's good to
felt
mix.
sometimes.
It's good to mix. Yeah, it's interesting now that I get older. It's like what I want to do with friends to pass the time. We're gonna go to the bar, pick at some like random undercooked wings from the local restaurant or something. What's fun to do? And D&D I think is still fun to do. Some things are not. Like I think I don't know, when I was younger I'd watch TV. That's no longer fun for me. I don't really like watching TV. I'll watch maybe a movie if it's really good on Rotten Tomatoes and worth my time, but like it's not worth the I don't know. I'm getting away from the point. You asked why do I think D&D is so magical? And I don't really know, man. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. It's a lot of things. One of the things which I think is interesting is that D&D just seems so old. It seems like we definitely came after I think D&D was at its top prime. But what I heard recently is that more people are playing D&D now than ever before. Like the D&D 5 is the most sold version or something like that. Pretty crazy. I don't know if that's true. Maybe we need to fact check that. But yeah, I don't know.
Devin, fact check that.
Yeah,
All
Devin.
right, I got Devin on it.
Who is Devin? A guy from somewhere?
Well, Devin, the intern at
He's our
myUX.
intern. Okay, that's good. Yeah. See, that's a real podcast. They'll have people who fact check them, right? Joe Rogan will have his dude.
Jamie.
Jamie's Joe's the guy. That's what the big controversy was about H3H3. They said that H3 was very disrespectful to the guy who looks up his stuff. I don't know what that's about, but yeah. So we got to be nice to Jamie, our intern.
Devin.
To Devin. Oh, see, I forgot his name. I'm not in a good start here. Devin. All right. So when Devin gets back to us, we'll have some information on that. But basically, yeah, I don't know. I like the idea of kind of discovering something old. That's why Heroes of Might and Magic is one of my favorite games. Right here. Oh shit. This game, man. Heroes of Might and Magic. Let's see if I can find it here. Heroes of Might and Magic. I played this game because I found it on like my mom's computer because it was like one of the few games she played back in her college days, and it was just such an amazing game. And I think a lot of the gold of it was just the discovery of it. And I think similarly, like when I'm reading a book, some of my favorite books are books that I kind of just happened across. Like I just chose to download it and listen to it, and it's like stuck with me for so long because it seemed like I almost discovered the treasures that it held. And I think that's something really special. I think it's also that D&D, it relies a lot on the people. It's a game that's very customizable, like Minecraft. And I think that's why Minecraft's going to be around for a very long time. Here's Minecraft right here, a little Steve picture. Yeah, Minecraft's got legs, man. And I think it's because it's vague enough that it could be used for anything. It's not so much a game, right? When you think about Dungeons and Dragons, that's not really a game. A game is something like, I don't know, when you fight the vampire, right? One of the campaigns. Dungeons and Dragons is different. It's a system. And
it's like tools.
It's like what?
Tools, like tools.
Tools,
to
yeah.
play.
It's like tools for a game, yeah. And I think that's what helps it kind of survive because it it could be reapplied and reinvented and twisted a
Yeah, there's
lot.
infinite amount of stories in it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool. And I think that's why it's good to make games that have a layer of like, I don't know, player customability or whatever.
Have you ever written a campaign for D&D, or do you usually use a module?
Um, I have never written one like yeah, I pretty much homebrew the campaigns for D&D. But what I try to do is I try to take modules that I really liked or characters that descriptions that I really like, and then I try to combine them in ways that are going to be interesting. So what I would do is I'd go through the monstrous manual, whatever that is. It's this giant book of all the characters that are in D&D, and I just go through it and I'd look for things that sound interesting. It's a huge ass PDF. And I'd find an animal and I'd be like, wow, that thing's so cool. I got to put it in the game. And then I put it in the game. Yeah. So I'm always looking for inspiration. I watch these YouTube videos of like cool puzzles and stuff, and then I do that. Yeah, the creation is definitely an amalgam of like combining different stuff. And that's what art always is, right? It's very rare that we really create something new in art. It's often just a reapplication or a new combination.
Yep.
Well, one of the other things we talk about the final tenet when we talk about games is technology. But this game, I don't know what I'd even say for that category, technology. I guess just dice. We talked about that. Talked about the wins of that. Is there any other thoughts you have on D&D, stuff you want to discuss on that front?
Well, anything else I want to discuss about D&D? I don't know. It's a special game. I think Ryan Iver will call me out because of what you just did. You know what I mean? In terms of he'll be like, well, if you thought it was so special, why'd you always ditch out on us? But I guess because I viewed it as like something that I always liked doing for fun, if that makes sense. And I never liked when it felt like it became a chore. I always wanted to do it because I wanted to do it, and also I felt like D&D sometimes required a lot of somebody, if that makes sense. Like you have to be there, or else if you're just gonna go and just kind of whatever it's like it's not a fun game. To me, it's fun if you're really actually into it and you're a part of it, and you really like try to make something special out of it. But so ultimately, though, I think D&D, as I said, can teach us a lot about storytelling in terms of you need to have an objective, or at least you should have an objective. Or if you don't have an objective, you should know what the characters will do besides that. So they need to have a really rich, beautiful story and world they have to be in if you're not going to have them actually have a firm objective. The difficulty kind of needs to ramp up. You shouldn't have like a giant boss fight and then they fight like two little skeletons. Like it's like you fight this giant dragon, you defeat him, and then two skeletons run in. What are you gonna do now? It's
Yeah,
like
yeah, that doesn't really work. That's a good point.
yeah, so it teaches us about accelerating in terms of the difficulty of combat and the reward and what people value and what they reward. It teaches you about how to bring people together essentially and how to make each person feel valued in their role. And as you said, like ultimately you have to be careful about listening to too much criticism or else all the roles become you have a battle cleric and a warrior priest who's like we're the same thing, and they both fight Anteal. So overall, I just have to say, like D&D, if you've never played it before, you should 110% get your friends together and just go for it. And it's super, and I don't think it's really the cost to do it is that much, really. You just need to buy some dice, or you could literally use your phone if you want to. I'd recommend just buying dice for like $20, like a bunch of dice,
I
like a
think
shit.
you should go to the D&D Adventures League. So now they have that. So you just
Oh,
go on meetup.com. You could find people who are playing near you, and you could jump in for a quick game.
well, I didn't recommend that. I recommend if you don't have, I would recommend doing it in person. But if you don't have anybody who wants to play near you,
This is
then
in
I would
person.
recommend
It's in
what?
person. Meetup, yeah,
Oh,
meetup.com will
really?
tell you people in person. Yeah, they have pickup games. It's called the Adventures League, and you just go into like a dice shop or something, and like they'll do something. And that's kind of dying out, isn't it? The whole idea of a card shop. I remember that was a big thing back in the day. Like we'd go to the magic shop or whatever, and they'd have Yu-Gi-Oh cards. But I think that's dying out a little bit.
Yeah, and the final thing I would say is D&D. It's hard to even rank it out of 10 or anything like that because, as you said, it's not really a game. It's like ranking like a hammer out of 10. It's
IGN,
like
10 out of 10. Well, we did that, right? Remember we looked at Amazon
reviews
reviews
of
for
hammers.
hammers?
Yeah, yeah, and I guess you can to some extent, but it's a staple. It's a classic. You should play it. Get out there and do it. And if you don't like it, play it again because it will tell you that the people with you it will be a good judge of if the people you're with suck or not.
I love that.